So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about Springfield Springfield Compost Collective, kind of let you know how we started, a little bit about what we do, and then I'll go into compost making because we need to know how to make really good compost before we can make compost tea. And yeah, so let's get started on Springfield Compost Collective. Our mission is to create mindfulness around food waste and the recycling process through composting and soil education. We've been around for 4 years now, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit. A little bit about myself. There's me and my first son. That was when he was a little guy. Now he's a year and a half, and he seems like a big guy already. So a little bit about me is that I attended Missouri State University for Sustainable Agriculture and Plant Science. When I finished up there, I moved out to California to help manage a 3-acre permaculture farm. And after that, I came back to Missouri to really start studying more and I had this drive to bring something to the community. And that turned into the Compost Collective. So before that, while I was kind of building the Compost Collective, I did the Master Gardener program in Springfield. I became a soils advocate through Kiss the Ground. I did the Life in the Soils Compost Making Microscope and Compost Tea Soil Food Web certification that's created by Dr. Elaine Ingham. I worked for Springfield Community Gardens. I was their AmeriCorps Vista Garden and Composting educator. I'm currently the president and co-founder of Springfield Compost Collective. And then I'm certified in Produce Safety Alliance through Cornell, USDA, and FDA. And then also I've done certified natural grown certifications. So what do we do? What does the Compost Collective do? Well, our slogan is that we are all about building mindful waste management, and we do this through 3 services to the community. So we offer a residential and business pickup for food scraps. We do education workshops for free, and then we offer a community bin access for free as well, so anyone can have a chance to compost their food scraps. Our food scraps pickup service for businesses, it starts at $50 a month. Residents, $20 a month, and we pick up every week. We give you a clean bin with a liner, and then we exchange it out every week. And then we have the free community bins throughout the city. We do educational workshops like this one or in person. We've worked with the public school system, private schools, MSU and Drury, and then the community gardens. We have community food scraps bins. These are their location. We have one at Altapasta, C Street, and then downtown. These bins are sponsored by either businesses or individuals of the community so that they can be free use, which is something really amazing. I think this is something that's actually really unique to Springfield, Missouri. I haven't seen this in any other part of the country. So I'm really happy to report that these food scraps bins are very successful and we don't have a lot of contamination and that our community is doing really good with them. We offer zero waste events. Well, we will go to an event either by a business or a nonprofit, and we'll set up stations, recycling stations, and compost stations to help keep your waste from going into the landfill. There's a picture of me from the Ozark Greenway fundraiser, where we were able to divert almost all the waste. And the bin that I'm holding there is the only amount of waste that went to the landfill out of 300 guests. So it's really a neat opportunity for the guests and for the businesses when they hold zero waste events. And we work with the event coordinator to make sure that it's a success. We do consultation services as well for farmers and gardeners. So let's get into it. If you've been with me before, how many people have been with us before?
Most people this is their first webinar or a first workshop with you.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Okay, this is more fun now. So let's start off with a question. And I always start my slides off with this one question to kind of get you to really get in the mindset of the importance of composting your food scraps. So how long does it take for a lettuce head to decompose in the landfill? And you can kind of just like think on a number in your head for a little bit, right? Is it 6 months, 1 year, 2 weeks? Let you think, hopefully you got a number. Well, this is the correct number. 25 years it takes for a lettuce head to decompose in the landfill. But in the backyard composting setting, it takes only 1 to 2 weeks. The landfill is not an environment for organic waste to decompose. And so this is why it's so important that we get our food scraps out of that environment and into an aerobic environment, an environment with oxygen, so that things can properly decompose. And we're going to go over why. So a little bit more on the awareness side, because this is a big part of the Compost Collective. 80 billion pounds of food waste is thrown away each year, which is equivalent to 1,000 Empire State Buildings. 161 million in food waste, 219 pounds per person, which equals about around $1,600 thrown away by the average family of 4. 30 to 40% of US food supply is going to landfills. The US is a global leader in food waste. And then production of food waste in US is equivalent to greenhouse gas emissions of 30 million cars. So it's not just getting rid of the cars and the gas-powered machinery, it's also getting our food scraps out of the landfill. Over on the right, you will see a graphic from the Institute of Local Self-Reliance. So if I have any teachers in the audience, they are a great resource to go to. We are on their community composting page, and we are part of their composting coalition group. They offer really great information for free. I recommend checking out their website. So some local numbers for Springfield. Springfield produces 660 tons of waste per day. 12% of that is food waste, which is over 31,000 tons every year. And that's equivalent to about 40 cars per day just driving into the landfill. And that is our food waste issue right now. And that's why we're here, to try to help get that number down. So we're living in a broken system, as you can see on the left, where we put our money to chemical sprayed food that then comes to us, and our scraps go to the landfill. And what the Compost Collective is all about, and what home composting is all about, is that we're closing the food loop. So where it goes, our food scraps go back into a composting system, which makes compost and goes back into the ground to feed our plants. Here's another example of the closed loop community composting. This is what we are striving for here, where we're picking up your food scraps, we're putting it through a composting system and giving it back to the community gardens or farms. And we keep this system going. This closed food loop system is how we have a sustainable future. So let's get on to building a composting area. This is a picture of a composting area that we built at a farm here in California. It's a 3-bin system. It was made out of all recycled material. And this is a very good size for their farm that they have. And we'll kind of start getting into things. So before we can start talking about how to build the composting system, we need to know what is compost. So compost is a decomposition of organic matter in an aerobic setting. So oxygen. Oxygen is key. If it's not really compost, if oxygen is not present. So I like to say that it's the natural recycling process that gives life and energy back to the earth, because compost exists in nature without us. So materials needed to start composting at home. I want to give you the most basic materials so that you can do it almost for free. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about in this. So you can get pallets recycled and heat treated. You want to make sure that they have what is looks like a little Christmas tree on them, and an HT, which means that it is heat treated. You don't want to use chemical treated pallets, because those chemicals over time can leach into your compost and kill your microorganisms that you're trying to grow. In Springfield, you can get a lot of recycled pallets at places. If you see them stacked up, what I would just do is go and talk to that business and ask if I could have some. And most likely they're like, yes, please take them all. So start to become friendly with some businesses and ask them if you could take their pallets off their hand. Chicken wire, which goes around the pallet so that you don't have food waste material going in between them. Cardboard, which we're going to go over why that's so important. You need mulch, paper, or leaves, which is your carbon source. A high nitrogen source and green materials, which we'll talk about here in a second. A pitchfork for turning. A compost thermometer, which I got right here. I think hopefully you can see me. It's very long. This one is made by Rio Temp, and we'll go over these compost thermometers here in a little bit as well. Nitrogen and carbon storage area, and then just a friendly reminder on your fridge or in your house where you can see it to go check your compost pile once in a while. So location. I'm going to turn this down here. All right. Location. There's a video playing about that is filmed at the Springfield Market Farm. And I wanted you to see how their composting system is set up. It is in a very good location compared to where their farm is. It's very close. It's in a partial sun and shade spot. It is surrounded by trees, but not too close, so that they can still move around it. So they have a very good wind factor where it's not super, super windy, so it won't dry out the compost. It's easy to access because you can get to it from both sides, and it's a proximity to the garden, which you can see right there. It has good air circulation around it. There's water close by, and the ground is level. And so what they've created is a whole composting system here where they have their sifter, which you just saw. They have their piles where their compost is laying out to be cured when it's finished, which is what you see right there. And then they have a 4-bin system, which we'll go over. Every time they turn their pile, they turn it to the next bin, and they turn all of them at the same time. And then as I walk over to the other side, you'll see underneath this little tree area is where they are holding their dried like weeds. Well, they'll dry out all their weeds before they go into the compost pile. And also they have a holding area for mulch and for green material. So it doesn't have to be sprung out like this in your backyard. I don't recommend it like this, but if you're a farmer and you have enough room, you can definitely have an area that's dedicated to it. So this is an example of one compost pile on a farm. See their green materials right there in those buckets too. So we'll go, and then it's right next to their shed, so it's easy to access all their tools, which is really important. And then I think I turn around here. Let's see. Yep. And then you can see how close it is to their garden. It's really important that you keep your compost pile as close as you can to your house, so you're more likely to go out there and use it. When you make it far away, even from myself, I'm less likely to go out there and monitor it. And compost piles are alive and living, and they need interaction just as much as gardening does. All right, so materials needed for a healthy compost pile. We need nitrogen, carbon, air, and water. So this is the most important thing that you could probably take away. And when I teach kids, I reiterate this to them all the time. You need green, brown, air, and water. And by the end of the workshop, they can always repeat it back to me. So without these 4 materials, you will not have a successful composting pile. So green material is your nitrogen, which are your food waste, your grass clippings, your coffee, any material that is living. Carbon is your brown material that has dried up or somewhat dead plant material, also can be cardboard and paper. And then air, because microorganisms, which is what we're growing in compost to decompose everything, needs oxygen just like we do. And then water, because those microorganisms need a water coating around them as well. So do you have any questions about materials so far? Are we good?
We have a couple of questions. The first one says, isn't chicken wire made of galvanized wire, which is toxic to food?
I don't know if it's made out of galvanized wire. That's the first time I've ever had this question. I haven't had any negative experience with compost with chicken wire. I will say that you do have to change it out. So like as it wears over time, you have to take it off and then put new chicken wire in. If you didn't want to use chicken wire, you can use a hardware cloth or any sort of very small, fine metal barrier. just because you don't want the food scraps going into it. But as far as chicken waste being toxic to food, chicken wire, that's a really good question. I'll look into it because I know a lot of farmers and people use chicken wire. They bury it in the ground to prevent from rodents coming up. They'll use them as trellises, and it's been, that's a really great question. I will look into it. I know over time, microorganisms will have an effect on metals, and so they can somewhat eat away at them. And that's another reason why you want to make sure to change it out as often as you can. But thank you. What else was there?
Yeah, another question says, what if you don't have a partridge shade area? I have full sun.
You can cover your compost. You could just put a tarp over your compost pile, or I'll have some pictures here in a second where you can actually build like a little structure that lays on top of the pallets to cover it. That's all. You just need to make sure that it has some sort of roof so that you're not losing a lot to evaporation, like a lot of your water to evaporation, and also that the sun isn't heating up your pile instead of the microorganisms, and you can get a false read on temperature. So just kind of providing a little bit of shade for them if you can.
The next question says, are some browns better than others? Would dry leaves be better than newspaper?
Yes, but a diversity in browns is the most important. So when you have just all one type of brown material, you're going to lack the diversity of microorganisms and bacteria and fungi in the compost pile. So having dried up leaves and having a little bit of shredded up newspaper and shredded up cardboard and mulch and mixing that all together and throwing it in your pile is going to be the best.
Okay. And then we have one more question. It says, I have a blender for scraps. Then do I dry it out, like drying out weeds, before adding it to the pile?
She has what for scraps? Blender?
A blender. Mm-hmm.
Oh, gotcha. No, with that, you don't have to dry it out. You just want to make sure that you kind of sprinkle it throughout the pile. And we're going to go over how you make a pile, and then I'll try to remember that, this is where you would, instead of taking your big clump of your food, of your blender waste, you want to kind of just like open it up and spread it all out and sprinkle it on top, because your clump of blender scraps is very moist. And when it sits into the pile, that little pocket will grow anaerobic bacteria, which is the bacteria that's in landfills that makes methane, that's not healthy for the environment. And we don't want that to happen. And also anaerobic bacteria are in charge of that really nasty smell and a bad rap for compost. So that's why you kind of want to break those materials up, spread them out, and get oxygen around them. Anything else before we go on?
All the questions right now. Yep.
All right, perfect. Okay, we're going to keep going here. So carbon, nitrogen, and water oxygen. So when I teach about compost, it's really important for me that everyone that I teach to understands why these sources are so important. My goal is that you kind of have the sciencey background behind compost, so that when you go and look at your pile and say, something's not right here. Well, I know that this and this are needed, and that if one of them is absent, this is the problem. So I'm going to teach you that side so you can kind of self-diagnose your compost. And you can always reach out to us and we try to help you as best we can. So carbon. Carbon is an energy source, the food for microorganisms. Just like carbohydrates provide energy source for us, carbon fuels the microbes' metabolism. And then nitrogen provides the proteins and enzymes that the microorganisms need for growth and to reproduce as rapidly as possible. So these two elements need to be touching each other. Right? Did you say something, Anna?
Yeah, we lost you there for a second.
Oh no. Let me go back here. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So carbon and nitrogen have to be touching each other to be successful, right? They need their food source and their protein and enzymes to be really close to each other so that they can get everything they need while they're working really hard to decompose. Water, everything living needs water. Microbes need a water coating around them so that they can move about through all the materials, and it also helps keep them alive, just like us. And so it makes things also very easier for them to compost. and digest. And I'll have an image for you on that as well. And then oxygen to prevent anaerobic bacteria from populating. So now we get on to how to build a proper compost pile. So the pile needs to be 4 by 4 by 4. So 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. The minimum size that you can make is a 3 by 3 by 3, and you can get away with that. But I always like to recommend 1 foot bigger. The reason why this is because through studies, they found that if a compost pile is that size, it can protect itself from outside elements. So when it rains, or if it's super, super hot one day and you forgot to cover it, or if it's really windy, it can protect itself for a certain amount of time when it is this size. Also, it has a very good air circulation when it's at 4 by 4. And what can happen is, as it's heating up in the core, it actually pulls the cool air from the bottom and then pushes the hot air from the top. And they've seen that with this size, that happens the best. So this is what we want to strive for. We talked about location earlier. We're going to put a cardboard barrier on the bottom or have compacted clay so we don't have a lot of liquid running off into the ground or running directly into the ground. We're going to have materials cut to 6 inches or smaller, which we'll discuss later on. And then we're going to do a layering system of brown and greens. And then also I like to add in a little bit of compost as well. And we'll show some pictures of that too. And then we cover it with a bio cover, which is a big thick layer of mulch or leaves or straw, and make sure none of your food scraps are exposed. As we're building it, we always want to water in each layer. We want 50%, regular turning and checking temperature. So here's an image that you can kind of see a little bit of how it should be, and then we're going to go over it in pictures. When you look up compost, it's always going to talk about nitrogen and carbon and nitrogen ratio, and you want to strive for 30:1. Carbon and nitrogen ratio can get really technical, and so I don't spend a lot of time on it. The most important thing with it to remember is this. Woody chips, as you can see, like mulch, can have a carbon and nitrogen ratio of anywhere from 200 to 1,000:1, okay? And then your food scraps are only 17:1 or 20:1. So if you have a really big, thick layer of wood chips, it's going to take a lot of food scraps to get down to where you need that ratio, to where it all decomposes well together, right? So the goal is that you just use very small layers of wood chips if that's all you have, and then maybe bigger layers of your leaf mulch or of your paper mulch. So just trying to get these numbers as close to as can, and just remember that when you have a carbon source that's really woody, it's going to take a lot of nitrogen to break that down. If you have, your only source is mulch, you can reuse your mulch over and over and over in your compost pile and keep adding your nitrogen to it until it's finally turned into soil. It just may take a lot longer. So make it easy on your future self by organizing your materials, your carbon and nitrogen storage area. This is probably the biggest downfall that I see with a lot of people, is that they build their pile, they're really excited to compost, they throw their first bucket of food waste in, and then now they're like, well, wait, I needed carbon. And now they're getting burned out because they're trying to have to rake up leaves or go source mulch. So when you go to build your composting area, make sure to build your carbon area as well, which is just, here's a good example of just some bricks together, or you can do another little hardware cloth or another little pallet area where that is just for your carbon storage. And so every time you go to add a bucket of your food scraps, you go and you take a bucket of your carbon and you put it on top as well to cover it up. Because never, ever, ever do you want food scraps exposed to the elements. This is what attracts pests and bugs and animals. And remember, compost doesn't break down, food scraps does not break down by itself. It has to be touching the carbon source, right? Because the microorganisms need both of them to then fully break down into the finished product. So here's a good image right here of water and why it's really important to have 50% moisture. So on the left, you can see that it's dry around these particles, right? And so the microorganisms, which are the little blue line, the small dots, there's not a lot of diversity there in microorganisms, and they're going to have a really hard time moving about through the particles, right? So that type of compost is not going to break down very well. And then when you have the image on the far right, where you have everything is saturated in water, if you look really closely, now you're starting to breed bad bacteria in there, which is the anaerobic bacteria, which is going to make your compost pile start to compost very, very slow, right? Anaerobic composting is not very effective at composting food scraps in a timely manner. That's why it takes 25 years for that lettuce head to decompose. So we want the middle ground where you have your particles that are perfectly coated in water, but there's still air pockets, right? And your microbes are able to move about, and you have a very big diversity of microbes in there. So that's why we're looking for 50%. Here is a video of what 50% looks like. So you take the compost with your hand, right? And you squeeze it as hard as you can. And if you have a few drops running off of your hand like this, here, I'll show it again for you, that you're at 50% moisture content, which is ideal for composting, right? So this hand test is the best way to do it. I know it can kind of sound gross, but you can put some gloves on and squeeze it. And I would do this at least for the first 3 weeks of your pile to really make sure you have the appropriate water content in there. So temperature. Checking the temperature is also really important because this shows you if your pile, if you created the correct carbon to nitrogen ratios, how active it is. Also, temperature is really important because if you want to put weeds or seeds into your compost pile, which you totally can, you need to reach a high temperature to kill them. It needs to go over 135 for at least 3 to 5 days to kill pathogens and weed seeds. And then when you turn your compost in 3 to 5 days, that temperature needs to go back up again because now you're incorporating new materials from different areas to the center, and you're going to kill those weed seeds that maybe were on the outside. Okay, so checking your compost pile with the compost thermometer is really fun to do with family, and I just get really excited because anytime I put my compost thermometer in the pile and I see that it's at 150, it just blows my mind. You know, a lot of questions I get asked is, well, how does that happen? How does it just get 150? Well, remember when the microorganisms are in there and they're metabolizing all this food they have? It's very similar to when we are working out, right? When we're running and we're exercising and we're sweating and our body's putting off heat and we're oxidizing, right? So the microorganisms are oxidizing inside the compost pile and they're reproducing very quickly and they're eating and all this, everything is happening. And that process right there is creating heat. And then with our cover on it, we're somewhat trapping the heat inside so that we heat it up to kill pathogens and seeds. And so another reason why it's important to turn and check moisture, because all these elements together is what is creating the perfect compost for your compost tea. Another thing is that if you buy compost from a compost processor and it still feels hot to touch, it is not ready. You don't want to use that on your compost pile. You want to let it sit, on your garden. You want to let it sit until it comes to ambient temperature. And this is another good reason to have a compost thermometer is because you can check that. It's safe to use manures in composting, and because you can check the temperature to make sure that it's getting up high enough to kill off any disease from that manure. It also shows where you need to turn it. So if your compost pile goes over 160, you need to get in there and turn it and make sure, because temperatures, if you happen to get your compost pile over 170, you can start getting into the range where your microorganisms are starting to now create alcohol. And if you've ever heard of composting facilities catching on fire, this is what happens. Their compost piles, they get too hot and they create alcohol, and then they have a huge chance of catching on fire. So never, ever, ever over 170. And then you have microorganisms at different temperatures, which is this slide right here. And you want as much diversity in your pile as you can get. So you can see that when you first start, you have the mesophilic stage, which you have different types of bacteria and fungi in that stage, right? Then as it increases over days, now those type of bacteria got it ready for the thermophilic stage, which now brings in another type of bacteria and that are more adaptive to that temperature and are more effective at breaking down different types of carbon, right? And then it stays at that nice peak for a while, and then it may go down again, and then you'll turn your pile and it will go back up, and then it will go down and up and down until all of your nitrogen, your food scraps, or your green material has been converted over by the microorganisms, and you may be left with just this beautiful brown, it should look like a 70% dark chocolate color compost, and it could still have chunks of mulch in there as well. So checking temperature, you want to take it from 3 different locations of your pile and then average it out, because as you can see on the diagram on the top, different types of different areas of your pile are going to have different temperatures. It's always going to be the hottest right in the center. Okay, and this is again why we turn the pile. Check as often as you can because it's fun and it tells you what's happening. So you can get that Rio thermometer, which I showed earlier, on Amazon or on their website for $20. We're also going to raffle off one today. You can get a large scale one if you plan on doing, if you're a farmer or have a big gardener and you have a lot of compost and you want to do a little bit bigger piles. I recommend getting a larger thermometer. And then remember, you want 135 to 160 for 3 to 5 days. If you are a farmer in here and you want to have organic certified compost, you have to follow a little bit different regulations, and you can reach out to me for those regulations. Okay, do we have any questions so far?
We do. We have some questions. The first one is, does our carbon storage pile need to be turned regularly like the compost, or can we let it be?
The people that are on here today are so smart. You guys are awesome, by the way. You have the best questions. Okay, so you want to turn your carbon source if it is a carbon source that's very small and leafy. Okay, because leaves will stack up on top of each other, and if they get wet, like in Missouri, that's a chance because it rains a lot, then you're going to start growing anaerobic bacteria. So yes, you want to go in there, kind of pitchfork it and fluff it up. Now, if you have mulch, you can still do the same thing, but if you leave your mulch there, it will actually start growing saprophytic fungi, which is, I'll have a picture of that for you here in a second. And if you can add those saprophytic fungi into your compost pile, it will inoculate your pile and you're going to have amazing compost. So depending on your materials will depend on if you need to turn it or not. Straw, yes, you want to fluff it up so you don't have bad bacteria going, right? So if your material is like really thick and woody, it has a lot of air pockets for air to travel around it, so it won't need to be turned as much. But if your material is flat and has a chance of not air pockets in, then you will need to turn it.
All right. The next question says, how do you keep critters from eating the food scraps if composting is left out in the open?
So remember how we talked about the compost getting really hot. So this is for hot composting, everyone, just to let you know. I meant to preface that. With hot composting, we like to leave it out in the open because we're so interactive with it, right? We're checking on it twice a week. We're always keeping it close, and it heats up. It gets really hot. So my dog learned a lesson. He tried to go into the compost pile when it was 150 degrees, and he instantly backed out, and he never did it again. So when your compost pile gets really hot, animals don't want to go in there. I always recommend people to actually put their hand in their pile cautiously to feel how hot it is, because it is a self-deterrent for animals. Now, if you, like where I am, there's possibilities of bears and mountain lions. So I have a hardware cloth that's completely wrapped around the compost pile, which I'll have a picture of. And that's the type of system that I use, right? But if you're in the city, You can have one area that's open, and then maybe you could put a little gate on it and you close it, okay? Or you put a little, some type of wiring over the top. Whatever works for you and makes you comfortable, just know that you want it to be easily accessible for you. You don't want to look at your pile and say, oh, I don't want to have to move that heavy pallet to turn my compost, because then you won't turn it. So just making it to what fits your needs is the best. Anything else? Take one more question, then we'll have to move on so I can get through everything.
Okay, this is a statement about earlier from Kristen. It says, Bob Jabot wants Justine to know, in relation to the question she had not been asked before, galvanized steel is zinc-coated steel. Zinc and steel are both safe for humans, animals, and plants. Some people actually take zinc tablets to improve their health. Waste that's high in acid, which interacts with the zinc, could produce salts if concentrated and taken in large quantities, could potentially produce a stomach upset, but generally very safe for humans.
Thank you, audience. See, I have the best people in the workshop right now. I'm glad to know that it's zinc, because microorganisms do and can metabolize zinc. So that's another reason why when you have it around, it will start to degrade really quickly, because the microorganisms can get in there and start taking it apart. That's another reason, which I'll tell you, which you'll see compost tea, when you make it, you don't use metal because of the possibility of having zinc in it. So thank you. Okay, let's get going because we have a lot to cover. So real quick, I'm going to go through some slides of building a compost pile, because I'm not with you in person to build one. So we built one with Springfield Community Gardens interns, and I took some photos. So we're going to fly through those real quick. All right, so when we're using dry materials, the first thing you want to do is start soaking them, because when you put them in the pile, they'll take all your moisture and then your pile will dry out. So we started soaking our straw. We layer the ground with cardboard, right? Because we want to have a barrier between the ground and the compost. The first time I ever made compost, I didn't put a barrier in, and the ground just soaked up all of my compost. It literally like just kept decomposing into the ground every week. And I was like, wow, the ground here really needs some compost. So having a barrier, like this is a very thick mulch barrier and then a very thick cardboard. And we like to use bicycle boxes because they're very thick and they're big. Best with friends and family, because it can be some hard work in the beginning. So now we're covering that up. Safe for dried weeds, we put those in the bottom, so that, or like kind of in the middle of the pile, so they're in the area where it's most active. And then we start watering. We water every single layer that we do. It's really important to chop and shred materials, because right from this research project that was done, they found that when materials are 2 inches or smaller, well, 1 inch here, but in between 1 and 2 inches, that is the best size for microorganisms to decompose them at a more rapid pace. So taking the time to shred up your materials will get you compost faster. Inoculate if you can. If you have soil, go into the forest and grab some forest soil, or get some soil from your garden and spread it onto your compost pile so you can get some native microorganisms that start working. And then keep your layering process going, right? So they've got a layer of lettuce. They're going to cover that with some inoculant of old compost, and then cover it with wood chips again, right? So you can't really see it. And then watering it in. And then keep going until it's at least 3 to 4 feet high. And then at the very end, there is no food showing, and they have this thick layer of straw and mulch as their bio cover. So they don't have to worry about any critters getting in here, because it has such a thick layer of their bio cover, and that pile is going to warm up and get very hot, which I know it did because I went back later a few days and checked on it, and it was already at 150. So diagnosing problems and knowing the solution. So the pile has a bad odor. When you're doing this, you always want to start with one solution. You don't want to do multiple ones at a time, because then you don't know what your actual problem was. So it has a bad odor. So you want to start with, okay, well, is it too wet? If it's too wet, then let me open it up, turn it, let it air out, and maybe put some dry carbon in there. All right. Then next, well, there's no composting seems to be taking place. So you want to check the moisture again, because it possibly could be too dry. And if you moisten it up, let that sit for a couple days, come back and see if it's active again by checking its temperature. If nothing is happening, then you can add some nitrogen to it. It's not hot enough, but moist enough. The pile is probably too small and there's not enough nitrogen as well. So build it up a little bit. If it's moist enough and smells fine, but it's not decomposing, then you definitely don't have enough nitrogen to fuel the pile. So feed it some more green material. I'm going to run through some slides to give you guys examples of builds. This is from this book right here, the Rodale Book of Composting, which will be raffling this off today. This is an excellent resource. I highly recommend this book for everybody. And in this book is a lot of these pictures that I'm going to show you. And it also has a how-to guide for building an at-home composting station. So as we run through these pictures, I'm doing it just to kind of stimulate your mind and see what you can make, what works for your yard or your situation. And I could take any questions as we roll through these pictures too. Do you have any questions, Anna? Uh-oh. Hello?
Hello?
Yep, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Do we have any questions while I roll through these photos?
Yes, we have one question. It says, if we're composting at home with our own personal food scraps, then it seems like it would be hard to start with multiple layers of greens. Is there a way to slowly and steadily add layers as our food scraps become available?
Yes, you can do that and still have a hot pile. So as your food, and also you can back storage. So you can have, 5-gallon buckets. So what I do is I have my countertop bin, right? And then I have, every time that countertop bin is full, I go and I dump it into my 5-gallon bucket outside. And then I put a secure lid on it. And so when I have a couple buckets full, that's when I will go and then dump them into the compost pile, and I'll have enough to make a few layers. And normally within just a couple weeks, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, I'll have a really nice big high pile. And even in that time that I've been adding, it's still heating up, right? I'm still checking its temperature and making sure that it's moist. And so when I get to that 3 or 5 feet high spot, I stop adding my food scraps that are coming in, and I start really monitoring that pile. I turn it, I check its temperature, I make sure that it's still getting hot. And then I will, like this system that I have right here, I will take the pile once it's big and it's sat there for 3 or 5 days and it's got up the temperature. And then I'll turn it into the middle pile right here, and I'll let it sit there for another, 5 days while I'm checking its temperature, so that I can start building my other pile over here. And then when it's ready to turn again, I'll turn it into this pile over here. We'll sit there for another 3 to 5 days to make sure that it's, at this point, it's probably going to start going down. You're going to see less and less food scraps. When you see almost no food scraps and it's turned into soil, you can turn it over into another storage area with a lid on it. So then that's where it sits until you use it. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that did. Thank you. That's the only question right now.
Great. So I'm going to kind of go through these pictures to kind of stimulate some ideas. This is compost areas that we build for gardens, in schools. We have a lot of signage. It's all made out of recycled material. I love this one. It really promotes air movement and it looks nice. Here's a hardware cloth style, which I really like as well. You can see the layering system in there. If you look closely, you see the greens and the straw and the brown. Okay, so cold versus hot. Cold composting. You can totally do cold composting at home. That is okay. I just want everyone to know that it takes anywhere from 6 to 2 years until it's a finished product. Sometimes you can experience nutrient loss. It does tend to conserve nitrogen over time, because when you're heating up the pile, sometimes you can off-gas nitrogen. It's less labor intensive. You don't need all the materials at once. It promotes fungal growth. And then you just have to be careful because it can be anaerobic because you're not in there turning it as much. And then sometimes you can have animal issues with cold composting. With hot composting, you're looking to get a product in 1 to 3 months. It kills weed seeds. It makes more compost. This is the only way that I would compost animals and bones and manure is through hot composting. And if you're on a farm, you can compost dead animals in a compost pile as long as you know how to make it appropriately and you put them right in the center. It requires more maintenance and care, a little bit more labor intensive. It's all about promoting oxygen, so it's aerobic. And sometimes it's going to be more bacterial dominant than fungal dominant because anytime you turn the pile, you can start breaking fungal hyphae. Oh, so here's a video right here of Springfield Community Gardens interns making a compost pile in the hardware cloth style. So in the background, you saw how we did the pile just in the open. Well, now you can do this style at your house too. You don't have to have all the materials at once. You can just kind of add it as you go too. So you see the big key here is that there's someone that's watering it, right? And that they're using some sort of measuring device. And right now the measuring device is these totes. So any material that they put into the pile, they're putting it into the tote first and then throwing it in to measure it out so that they can keep their ratio, right? And I really highly recommend that. You can do it with 5-gallon compost buckets. Is that if you have a 5-gallon bucket of food scraps you throw in there, then you want to throw in a 5-gallon bucket of mulch or leaves in there as well. And then he inoculated it with some finished compost. And he basically, they do this all the way until the very, very top. And, you know, it doesn't have to be just food waste that you put into your pile, right? You can put in your grass clippings. You can put in your tree clippings, your vegetable garden clippings. You want to make sure you shred it all up before you put in there. I mean, it's a cleanup process is what composting is. And so now she's using a machete to make sure she cuts up all the materials so they're small enough for microorganisms to get in there. And watering it in. And then they'll keep doing this all the way into the very top. This pile right here, they wanted to use to kind of clean up all the weeds and everything around them. And when you make a pile in a hardware cloth like this, it's really nice to watch it decompose, and it's really easy to be interactive with it and check its temperature. I've had really good success with hardware cloth piles. And they're very easy to turn because all you have to do is take the wire off, move it to the side, and then throw in the stuff into the hardware cloth that's set to the side.
Justine, we have one question. We have one question. Is now a good time to ask it?
It is work. As you can see, they are working. So sometimes building it all at once, if you're going to do that, it definitely is nice to have some help while you're doing that. You know, when you add straw to your compost too, it helps to build protozoa microorganisms. So that's really important. They're very good for the soil, and again, diversity helps promote different types of microorganisms. So they're going to the very, very top, and then they'll cover it with a pile of mulch, and they're spreading it out all the way to the end. If you have a lot of stinky food waste, sometimes I like to recommend that you don't spread it out to the end of the microfiber, the hardware cloth, and that you kind of keep it like maybe a couple inches inside of it, so you can kind of make sure that there's no food exposing on the outside to attract pests. But those pests aren't going to go very far because not a lot of them can withstand the heat inside of that compost pile. Another reason of why you shouldn't put worms in your compost pile, because worms will die over 90 degrees. And so you don't want to put them in there because they'll just bake inside one of these piles. Once the pile decomposes and becomes to the ambient temperature outside, then it will actually attract the worms, and then they'll come into it themselves. All right, so that was it. So basically what we're doing here is our whole goal is that we're mimicking what's happening in nature. So a reason why compost should smell like the forest floor and look this beautiful dark brown color is because this is what happens in nature. This is the natural cycle of the earth, and we're just trying our best to put it into a small system to take care of our food scraps and our green waste. Another thing I like to touch on when it comes to color is that compost should never be black. I don't know why they started calling it black gold. That's not good. If compost is black, that means that there's anaerobic bacteria present for the majority of its life. And anaerobic bacteria is what makes that black color. So I always recommend not buying compost if it's black. You want to look for a nice, rich, dark brown. Go get a 70% dark chocolate bar and put it right next to your compost. And if it's that color, you're doing really good. So these are the saprophytic fungi that I was talking about that you can grow in your mulch. If you see this, these are the good guys. Be really happy that you have these in your compost pile. They break down carbon into soil. So you want to keep those guys around. Turning, as I said earlier, promotes oxygen. It helps to decomposition. It keeps your pile healthier, and it's a great workout. And so how you want to turn your pile is basically you want to flip it from the inside out. And here is a video courtesy of Troy from Living Roots Compost Tea. It's a little shaky, but he's going to show you how you properly turn. So you take off the top, right? And he's going to show you how there's parts that you set aside. And you want the hot core material to go on the bottom because the hot core is where all the microorganisms are at and they've already started decomposing. And when you put them on the bottom of the pile, they will actually move up through the pile to the center, okay? So remember, you're flipping everything inside out so that everything gets touched by microorganisms and everything gets hot. And so that you can make sure that it's being decomposed properly. He's able to do this all by himself, but again, I recommend that you have a friend or just take your time doing it. His pitchfork that he's using is really nice. It has multiple fingers on it, which makes it a lot easier too. So, and another reason why I like to do the hardware cloth is that you really can make sure that you're touching everything this way. Sometimes when people go to turn their pile, they'll forget to turn the very bottom, and you'll go in and you'll see that there's this huge layer of anaerobic bacteria. Well, now the anaerobic bacteria and the aerobic, the good guys, are going to constantly be battling out, and you don't want that. So that's why you really want to make sure to get in there and turn your pile as well as you can. And then that's it, tops it off and he's done. So vermicomposting is also a good option for compost tea. Just remember that it takes a specific worm. You have to use red wiggler worms. You cannot feed them acid or citrus. Their temperature and moisture has to be controlled, very important. They actually breathe through their body, so you need to make sure that they don't get too hot and that they stay nice and moist. They need air to move around. They need air and room to move. They need bedding material. But if you can do this all correctly, then you get a very valuable worm casting. You can make your own bin or you can purchase one. All right, so application with compost, 2 to 4 inch layer in the beds. Compost works best with living roots because remember, it's full of microorganisms, and microorganisms need living roots to stay alive and to reproduce. They have a symbiotic relationship with each other. So just putting a layer of compost down and walking away for months and months and months is not the greatest use. It's really good to either put a cover crop in there or start planting into it. But you can also use compost as mulch. Compost is, it's really good for everything. But if you want to keep those microorganisms alive that you just worked really hard to grow, it's best to put living roots in the ground. Can be used around trees. Never put it in the hole with a tree. Make sure compost is cured. Do the smell test. Side dressing to help suppress weeds. You can use them in house plants and seedling mixtures. Application is not just for your gardens, it can be for lawn care too. You can make it really fine and sift it out to your lawn, and it has, as you can see, a really good effect on lawns because this is what plants need, is microorganisms. There's lots and lots of healing powers of compost. I love it, and that's why I love talking about it, and I create a nonprofit about it because I believe that compost is a huge factor in helping us fight global warming. And because of its abilities to filter out pollutants, its ability to hold water, it can hold 5 times its weight in water. it's just a living source, then we're providing that living source back to the planet, which is also living. That helps protect our watershed. So in Springfield, that is extremely important. We should have compost on all over the landscape. It helps reduce runoff. And then we did a research project with MSU, and we found that when we applied compost to overly tilled soils, here you can see one row was compost with food scraps, one row was no compost, and then one row was compost with just green, like yard waste. The row that had compost that was made with food scraps created the most nutrient dense food out of all the rows. And MSU was able to do this because they had new technology to be able to extract from the plants to see how much nutrients was in it. So this project was really amazing. It proved that compost makes healthier food. So let's get into the soil food web. Soil food web is what we're trying to grow in compost tea. This is what we should be always thinking about when we're gardening and when we're going out in nature, is starting with the small guys, which then lead to the bigger guys and leads to a healthier system. So remember I was talking about how it's really important to have water and air pockets around in your compost. Well, it's also really important to have those in plants, right? And as you can see from on the right, there's a little nematode that's running around. Troy does microscope work for individuals, anyone really. You can send him a sample of compost or soil and he will look at it underneath the microscope and tell you what type of living organisms are inside to kind of help tailor tea and compost for your needs. So this image on the left is really important because it shows you how fungal hyphae is connected to the root and how it wraps around the soil and organic matter, and how important it is to have these air pockets, and how the nematodes and the celiacs and the protozoa, they're in the water, which helps them move around through the organic matter, right? So I love that image on the left. So compost adds fungal hyphae along with other beneficials to soil, helping fight against root-feeding nematodes, disease, and pests. Synthetic fertilizers and overworking the soils, it kills the good guys. So right here is a bad nematode. And just to let you know that nematodes, most nematodes in the world are good ones. For some reason, we think nematodes are bad because there's a very small population of bad nematodes, which are root-feeding nematodes. And they tend to get out of control when you use synthetic fertilizers or you overtill, because you're creating an environment where they don't have a competitor now and they can just come in. Here you can see a fungal hyphae that has trapped a root-feeding nematode, and it's keeping it from going into this tomato plant. But down the bottom here, you see that, well, there's no fungal hyphae from over-tilled soils, and so the root-feeding nematode was able to get in. Here's some more videos. One on the left is a fungal hyphae in compost tea, which we're able to see through a microscope. And Troy Hinkie can do this work for you. You just got to go to livingrootscomposttea.com and you can send him a sample and he will look at your compost and tell you what's in it. And then over here on the right, you can see where it's very active. There's a bunch of flagellants and protozoas and amoebas. They're all moving around in there. This is just to show you that everything is alive. Your compost is alive, your soil is living, and it's not just something that we should take lightly. We need to care for it. All right, so microbes. Microbes make nutrients available in the form plants can digest, right? So microbes go to plant roots, which help feed the plant, which then the animals eat, which then sometimes we eat animals or sometimes we eat plants, and then we gain those nutrients from the microbes, and then we will compost our leftovers to go back into the system, right? So this is a closed system, and this is what we're trying to create with compost, and this is what we're trying to create with compost tea. So compost tea equals lots of microorganisms. Compost tea is water in which finished compost has been aerated. Compost tea is aerated and brewed in for a period of time with the goal of extracting the beneficial microbes from the compost while providing the perfect environment for them to multiply and reproduce. So Now we're going to start getting in the compost tea. I'm going to kind of start going along quickly because I only have 30 more minutes with you, and I really want to make sure that I get through this compost tea part. And at the end, we will go through questions. So save those questions until the end right now. Anna, are you still there with me?
I'm still here.
All right, great. All right, so here we go with some videos from Troy. Troy couldn't join us today. He really wanted to be a co-presentation presenter with me, but he had to work. So instead he made some videos, and I've uploaded those videos for you. He is a compost guru. He worked with Rodale Institute, and I really trust his knowledge, and he is a very great and incredible human. So here's some videos for you.
Hey everyone, my name is Troy Hinkie and I'm the owner of Living Roots Compost Tea. I specialize in soil microbiology, compost, and compost teas. I'm also the host of the podcast, What's Brewing, a compost podcast. Today we're here to talk a little bit about soil food web, and especially to show you how easy it is to make compost tea. So just give you a little bit of background quickly about why compost tea works, or why even use compost or compost tea, and it's all about the soil microorganisms. So plants and soil microorganisms have had a symbiotic relationships for tens of thousands of years now, before humans were ever on the earth, where plants are putting out foods through their roots to attract beneficial bacteria and fungi, and then these beneficial bacteria and fungi are going to be feeding off of those exudates along with organic matter in the soil and holding those nutrients in their own bodies until they're eaten or die, and then those nutrients and minerals are released in a plant available form. So the plants know their nutrient needs, and they're trying to attract these bacteria and fungi to their rhizome to then have them in place for their predators to come along and eat them, supplying the plants with the nutrients, nutrition, and minerals that they need. So with that in mind, we're going to be using compost and compost tea to get these soil microorganisms back into the soil where we may have lost it due to chemical usage or tillage or compaction, something that's going to be harmful to the soil and soil microorganisms. So how easy is it to make compost tea? Pretty easy. You just need a few things. We need some quality compost. This is compost that I've made here on site. I've got some other worm castings mixed in. So you can also use vermicompost if you don't have any quality compost on site. You can purchase some vermicompost. If you're looking for some good compost, you want something that's broken down well. So the more finer the material, the more microorganisms have broken that down. So you know that there is a lot of microbiology in there, for one thing, but also you're going to get all that good sediment out into the water and have what you need. Is these microorganisms are going to be clinging to the surfaces of that organic matter, and so the more tiny little pieces you can get out into the water, the more microorganisms you're going to get out into the water as well. So the idea behind compost tea, and it's called compost tea because of the way that you make it. You put compost in a mesh bag and put it in water and agitate it, just the same way that you make tea that you drink. It's called compost tea because of the way that it's made, not because you drink it. It's for plants. I get a lot of questions because people automatically think because it's called tea that it's something for humans or made from tea leaves or plants. I get some different weird stuff. Anyway, you're going to need good quality compost, and then from there, quality water, clean water, and something to brew in. It's easy to, most everybody has a 5-gallon bucket or some type of bucket that's 2 to 5 gallons, so that's easy to use. And then you can get a paint strainer bag for $2 to $3 just at your local paint store. I like to get these ones that have elastic at the top, so it's an elastic top paint strainer, 5-gallon paint strainer bags. And those fit nicely where you can just put it right around the rim of your bucket, and then it stays in place, and you can put your compost in there and not worry about anything getting into your water. So bucket, bag, water, compost. The only other thing that you might need is a water pump. So you can get this at an aquarium or fish store, pet store, or even a hydroponic store. Should run you somewhere between $20 and $40. This is just one that I had from a long time ago when I worked at a pet product store, you can get some more commercial type ones made by Active Aqua, and I think the other company is Aqua Air. You can look for those online or at a local hydroponics store. This one, I believe, was around $30. You want to make sure that you have enough air in here where you're getting 6 parts per million dissolved oxygen, or most people aren't going to be using a meter. You just want to have what looks like a rolling boil to your water, and then you're going to have enough air where it's staying oxygenated. So the idea behind this is that we are taking compost, putting it into a bag, and putting it into the water, and then we're extracting these microorganisms out into the water. So you can make just a simple extract where you're putting compost into the mesh bag, putting it in water, and just say for ease of numbers that we're extracting 1,000 microorganisms out into the water. So then you would take that with 1,000 microorganisms and spray that onto your soil. The idea behind compost tea, as opposed to extract, is that we're taking that same thing and adding foods to that, and then those foods are meant to get those 1,000 microorganisms to reproduce to, say, 1 million microorganisms. So we take our compost, put it in a bag, put it in the water, and we add foods to it. I don't have anything with labels here, but this is some fish hydrolysate. You can purchase that at any garden store or online. I also like to use humic acid. I've got some powdered humic acid. I believe the label's kind of messed up on that. I like to use OMRI approved products because then I know that they're good and organic. So that's the OMRI approved humic acid powder in a powder form. You can also get it in a liquid form. The liquid form is nice because it mixes up easier. Those are the 2 best things that I like to stick with are humic acid and fish hydrolysate. You could also use kelp either in a liquid form or a powder form. I happen to have some here in a powder form. So you're adding, just in 5 gallons, you'd be adding 1 tablespoon of humic acid, 1 tablespoon of fish hydrolysate, and then letting that brew with your air. And for a compost tea, we're going to let that brew from 12 to 24 hours, just depending on how hot it is. So in the summertime, when it's real hot, you want to just brew for 12 hours. And when it's a little bit cooler, in the spring or fall, you want to stick to brewing for 24, or if it's a little bit chillier out, even 36 hours. And then you want to use the compost tea within 20 to 48 hours. So I'd say the hotter it is out, the quicker you want to use it. So in the summertime, you'd want to use it within 24 hours. In cooler months, somewhere within 48 hours. But it's real easy to make. Take some compost, put it in a bag, put it in water. You've got an easy extract that's quick and easy to use. Or you can add foods like I spoke about and let it brew overnight. And you've got a compost tea that's ready to go the next morning. Then it's just as easy to apply. You can use anything from a watering can to a backpack sprayer to a 4-wheeler with a spray boom or a drip emitter, or a large tractor with spray emitters or drip emitters. Any scale, you can go from garden scale to large. The same as a large scale monoculture farm is going to be spraying chemicals. You can use that same type of equipment. As long as you can spray water or chemicals, you can spray out compost tea. So it's just that easy. If you have any other questions, Justine will supply you with my email, and you all can email me with any questions. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying the class.
Okay, so we learned from that video, as long as everyone's still with me, is the basic needs of composting, right? So 2 to 5 gallon bucket, quality compost, an air pump, clean water is extremely important, right? You can't have chlorine water because that chlorine kills microorganisms. So it's really important that you either pump out the chlorine, which can take a couple hours. You can just let your pump go and off gas the chlorine, or you collect rain, or you make sure that your water is clean by testing it with test strips, which I think everyone should always do, because if you're going to take the time to build tea, you don't want to find out that it's dead because you use chlorinated water. Compost tea bag strainer, and then microbe food. Right here, you can see Compost Tea Labs bucket. You can get this from their website for $115. It comes with everything you need. I actually have one here with me. We're gonna raffle one of these off today. So someone in the group here will get this awesome bucket. It has a really good bubbler system that's made for a 5-gallon bucket to go and sit down into. A very good pump. It comes with food. It comes with a bag, and then inside this bag here actually has a recipe for you. So you don't have, so you can double check and make sure you're doing everything right. Comes with micro food. It even comes with 2 little bags of compost for you, which I thought was really sweet too. Moving on, the benefits of compost tea. So you can tailor tea to plant and land needs. This picture you see on the left was a research project that Troy did. He does a lot of research. It's a hemp plant, and on the left, the hemp plant was, it had a dose of compost tea, and then on the right, the one did not, and you can see the difference in the root growth, which I think is drastic. And then these were planted at the same time in the same field next to each other, just one had compost tea and one didn't. And then they also noted that the side that had compost tea was able to hold water better, which is huge in dry climates. You can make bacterial or fungal dominated tea depending on your needs, which I'll talk a little bit about too. It's not harmful to any life, which is great. You know, I have a 1-year-old that loves to be in the garden, and I know that I can spray compost tea and he can be in there 5 seconds later and he's going to be fine. And this is a reason why I think compost tea is really beneficial for our environment and should be being used on parks and our farmlands, because it's not going to hurt us in the long run. It's money saving because it's not as expensive as chemicals. You get better root growth and soil life. It helps fight against pests and disease, which I thought was really interesting. In this book right here, Teaming with Microbes, we're gonna raffle one of these off as well. It's an incredible book. I highly recommend this one. It has an amazing chapter on here about compost tea. I actually learned something from reading this book. Compost tea, they did some studies with it, and they said it helped prevent powdery mildew, which I know we have a lot of in Missouri, downy mildew, gray snow mold, pink snow mold, crown and root rots, and dampening off issues with starts, summer patch and brown patch and rust and fairy wings. It depends on like the type you make. Bacteria dominated tea specifically helps with leaf spot and yellow patch. It also was effective in getting rid of weevils and grubs and white flies and fire ants and scale, which I thought was really cool as well. And that is because when you spray it onto the plant specifically, plant leaves actually exudate, right? They put out sugars that are attracting microorganisms to come to that leaf area. And so when you have bacteria and fungi on a leaf area, okay, and then you have a mold or some sort of bad fungus or disease come and land on your leaf, well, you already have it populated with really good microorganisms that can now fight off those bad microorganisms. So it gives it a better chance of survival, which I think is really great. It's nature's natural self-defense system, this positive microorganisms. Bigfoot concentrate here is mycorrhizal that you can put into your compost tea to specifically tailor tea to perennials, right? Because sometimes when you make compost tea, it can be more dominated in bacteria, and bacteria is really good for annuals or vegetable gardens, but fungal dominated compost tea is really good for perennials and trees. And so if this is something that you're looking for, you can purchase this on their website and put it into your compost tea. It already has kelp and worm casting and humic acid into it. And now you're inoculating your compost tea and making it ready for perennials. Here's another research project that was done at Rodale Institute with compost tea. We're on the left. So they laid out sod right? And then one side of the sod was treated with tea, one side wasn't. The side after 6 weeks that wasn't treated with tea, they literally could just roll back up, as you can see that photo right there. And this, the one on the left, the sod that was treated with compost tea, had developed an intense root system that went into the ground. This is what we're looking for in our plants. This is what we want in our grasses. We want a deeper root system so that's more resistant to drought. Troy does, in his business, he sprays compost tea on lawns, and here's a little example of what has happened in just a few months on this lawn that he sprayed. Same with, after he taught someone how to make compost tea, they did an experiment with their houseplants. This is really cool because these houseplants right here, the experiment was done during the winter months, right? When plants normally slow down in the winter. But you can see here on all these plants that he documented from December to March, their growth, which was huge. Houseplants do not need sterile potting soil like everyone tells you. They are a part of the same system around in the world too. They need microbes and food. And so giving them a dose of compost tea can take them from like the one on the left to the one on the right on just a few months, which I think is really amazing. So right
Hey
here,
everyone, this is Troy.
he's gonna go into how you actually brew compost tea. So we're gonna watch this real quick.
Troy Hinkie with Living Roots Compost Tea, back with another video. This one is all about compost tea brewing. We're going to break down the process of starting a compost tea brew. So I've got 5 gallons of water here. I've got my high biology, high quality compost. I've got some powdered humic acid, and I've got some fish hydrolysate. And then I've got my brew bag, and I've got my air pump. So starting with water, we want good quality water. You can capture rainwater. That's going to be the best thing to do. Or if you have a local spring water that's fresh, you can do that too. Otherwise, if you're going to use water from your home water that's from the city and you have chlorine and chloramine, you're going to want to off-gas the chlorine and chloramine. You can let the bucket, fill the bucket up and let it sit outside for 24 hours. And just by letting it sit, that'll help to off-gas chlorine or chloramine from it. Or you can put your air pump on for 12 hours, say, and that's going to also help to off-gas that chlorine and chloramine. So once we have our clean water, you also want to have it acclimated to your temperature. So we're going to brew any compost tea at the same ambient temperature as what we're going to apply it to for our plants. So if you're going to be applying it outside in the middle of the summer, you want to be brewing outside so that it's at that same ambient temperature. If you're going to be applying all the compost tea in a greenhouse like I'm in right now, you're going to be wanting to brew in the greenhouse so that you're at the same ambient temperature as what the plants are going to be at. So we've got our water here. First, we're going to get our compost out. So for 5 gallons of water here, you're going to want to use 3 to 5 cups of compost. I've got my cup measurer here. I've got my elastic top 5 gallon brew bag, and I'm going to put some compost in there. Now I'd said 3 to 5 cups, so I'm going to go ahead and use 4 cups. That's 3, there's 4. I'm going to set that off to the side right here. Now, I don't have electricity in here where I'm giving this video, so I'm just going to pretend that I have electricity, and then I'm going to be able to plug this in. So I would take my air pump, and we want the air to travel through the entire column of water because we want this entire volume of water aerated, oxygenated with air. So we want to have our tubes at the bottom of the bucket. Now you can get creative with this. I like to use old forks where I just put the tubes in between the tines of the forks, and those are going to weight it down at the bottom of the bucket so that I've got my air flowing through the entire column. You could use some nuts or possibly some suction cups. You just want everything with this to keep it simple and as easy to clean as possible. So that's why I like using forks. I would attach my forks to this, put it on the bottom of the bucket here, and turn my aerator on, and you would hear it buzzing, and you would see the air bubbling up in the water here. And it's nice to have the air on first, because then you're going to have agitation in the water for when you add your foods. It's going to go ahead and help to stir in your foods as you add your foods for microbes. So let's pretend that this is running and bubbling, and that's going to bubble in my water. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is measure out 1 tablespoon of humic acid. You want to use minimal foods. Like I said, 1 tablespoon of humic acid. And I generally use a stick to mix it up. I don't have a stick on hand, so I'm going to use something else. But I'm going to go ahead and dump my fish hydrolysate in at the same time. I would normally mix that up first and then mix this in as well. So I'm going to get 1 tablespoon. Dump that in there. Now I just stir it up real well because I'm using some powdered humic acid, and it doesn't stir in quite as well as the liquid stuff does. So I'm stirring that up, but also as you have your air on there, that's going to help to agitate the water and bubble it and help to stir the microbial foods up into the water. And now we're ready for our compost. I'm going to set these aside, and I'm going to take my compost, put the bag in there, fix the elastic to the top there, and now I want to massage the compost. I'm going to grab onto any chunks and squeeze and massage any soil aggregates or anything in the compost that we're breaking all those chunks up, getting everything down to as small a size as possible so we can get it out into the water and get that sediment out into the water. We want all those tiny little microscopic pieces to be out into the water. They're all going to be full of microorganisms, and the microorganisms are what we're working with, which is going to be the good stuff. So I generally spend 3 to 5 minutes just sitting here stirring and squeezing and working the material up against the edge of the bag here. And you can even kind of clean your hand off and work it from the outside to, if this were in the water, I'd be squeezing it and massaging it like this. So I'm kind of working it like this, squeezing everything around, get everything out into the water. And then I would do that, like I said, for 3 to 5 minutes to massage it. And we'd leave our air on there and brew. So this is compost tea that we would then brew for 12 hours to 36 hours, depending on the temperature outside. So when it's really hot in the summer, I'd mentioned this in our other video, when it's really hot out, you're going to have less oxygen, more oxygen being used up within the tea. Plus the hotter temperatures make the microorganisms more active. So it's going to be finished a lot quicker, so you can take it off the air in 12 hours and use it. And then in colder times, or as you're in the springtime or fall, it's going to take 48 hours or even 36 hours if it's rather chilly. You're not going to be wanting to brew anytime below like 40, 45 degrees. Anytime especially the soil, but the outside temps are below that, you're not going to want to be applying compost tea. So yeah, leave it on air for 12 hours to 36 hours, depending on what's the temperature outside. Then you can take this. Anytime I'm putting it into a backpack sprayer or something that's going to have things that can clog up, I would take a similar bag. You could even empty this bag out and kind of rinse it off, and then use it to go through a second filter. So you're filtering out some of the sediment that's going to be in this bucket so that you're not getting it into your backpack sprayer, or if you're using some type of sprayer on an ATV or a tractor or something like that, it's going to help you to keep from clogging that up. And then you can dilute this compost tea down. So we did research with 5 gallons per acre at Rodale. I usually tend to like to use 10 to 20 gallons per acre, but you can dilute it down wherever you need to. So if you have a little garden and it takes you 5 watering cans full of water to water the whole garden, then you can use 1 gallon per watering can there and split it up amongst the 5 watering can fulls and get it out in your garden however you need to and dilute it down. But just remember to use it within 24 to 48 hours again, and that's how to brew tea. Pretty simple.
Okay, is everyone still there?
We are here.
Awesome. Okay. So real quick, I'm going to just run through those steps with you. I know we're running short on time. I knew this was going to be close because there's so much to cover. So I'm going to run through some steps and then we'll finish up. So as you can see with him, dechlorinated water, you need to off-gas it. One thing I wanted to note was that you could buy a carbon filter, and 1 cubic foot of carbon filter will filter 4 gallons of water a minute. So that's something to invest in, especially in Springfield if you're using the Springfield water. And then always test your water at test strips. Having everything on hand, if you notice that he had everything right there, it makes it a lot easier. If you don't have fish emulsion, you can also use molasses and maple syrup. Just make sure that molasses and maple syrup don't have any preservatives in them, or else you're killing microorganisms, because that's what preservatives do. You need your kelp or humic acid, and then you have to have a clean bucket and bubbler. You can't have dirty buckets because then you can possibly inoculate it with bad bacteria. You want to be mindful of the direct sun, the temperature, and possible spillage. You start your brewing. You brew it for 12 to 24 hours, depending on temperature, and then you can apply within a few hours. I like to apply within that day. I don't necessarily like for it to sit overnight myself. And then you repeat as often as you can, and then this creates happy soil, happy plants, happy people. The do nots of compost. You do not want to overfill your bag, because then the compost won't be able to move around with the bubbler. And remember, it takes a lot of motion to get the bacteria off of the organic matter. A really good example is like the plaque in your teeth and the bacteria in your mouth. You know, every day we brush our teeth twice a day and floss to make sure we don't get that buildup. And that's how hard, like, we have to work really hard to get that off. The same with compost. We have to work really, really hard to get the microorganisms off of the organic matter, because they create these bioglues that hold them onto the organic matter so they don't get washed away. So that's why he massages it and we let it run with lots of bubbles, because those bubbles will push them off over time, right? So we let it, also do not, so you don't want a dirty bucket because of bioslime. You don't want to skip testing your water or let it sit unaerated for a long time, because then it can go and be anaerobic. You don't want to use bad compost, and you don't want to overthink it. So if you're on a larger farm and you want to upgrade, you can upgrade to a 5-gallon bucket for around $20. And here's an example of what Troy did. You can get these buckets, these big bins sometimes at soap refill station. She tends to give them away for very cheap. Here's fittings, a spout. There's the air pump that he uses. This air pump comes in the compost tea lab giveaway that we're going to give away. He uses these PVC pipe connections. The most important thing to remember is that you don't want to permanently connect those, because after every brew, you want to take that all apart and wash them out. So don't glue the PVC together. And then putting it up high so then you can easily empty it out. Application, you can never ever apply too much compost tea. That's why it is so incredible. You want to apply in the evening or early morning, because the UV rays kill microorganisms. You want to spray with a drop diameter of at least 1 millimeter. This book that I was reading, they recommend using a concrete sprayer because it has that prerequisite in it. It also allows for bigger drops to come out and fall a little bit nicer, because the sprayer can sometimes kill microorganisms. So you want to be mindful of that too. And you don't want to exceed pressure of 70 psi. It's best to apply in early spring and fall when leaves are on the ground, so the microorganisms have a lot of food that they can start munching on. And like I said earlier, don't put it in metal buckets, because microorganisms can slowly metabolize the zinc in metal. The amount that you put. So you can test the area first. You can send in a sample to Troy and he will tell you what your soil is lacking. And then you can try to brew compost specific to those needs. The general rule is 5 gallons per acre as a soil drench, and then 10 gallons for foliar spray. So if your yard or garden, if you were previously using chemicals on it, you want to spray compost tea every other week for 3 months, because that's how long it's going to take to get the chemicals out and to populate the beneficial microorganisms. If you haven't ever applied chemicals, you can just start by doing once every month for a season. And then from there, you can do 3 times a year. And then from there, you can just go from spring and fall. Myth busting real quick. Compost is not leachate. It is not manure, teas, or extracts, which get a bad rap because those can create anaerobic bacteria, which are harmful to humans. It's not smelly. I will say that if you use a fish emulsion, sometimes it can get a little smelly from that, but if you don't use it, it should still smell earthy and sweet. It's not anaerobic. It's not for human consumption, like Troy said, and it's not meant to be too hard, so don't overthink it. Compost tea is dead or snake oil. I hope after this workshop you've learned that it's definitely not the case. With multiple studies that have been done with brewing compost, it has shown that it started off with 1 billion microorganisms in the compost, and at the end of the brewing, it went from, in 1 teaspoon, it went to 4 billion microbes. Because remember, the whole goal is that we're feeding them and we're making them reproduce really quickly so that we can spread them out and they can start building the soil food web underground, which makes healthier plants. If you're interested in knowing how that system works, you can watch my other workshop on Springfield Community Gardens, and we go more into how soil works and how microorganisms work in the soil. So to wrap it all up, one thing that you guys can get from this is that microbes rule the world. They always have. They're in our bodies. They're surrounding us. Healthy soil promotes a healthy biome, which promotes healthy futures, right? Healthy soil, you get healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy human, healthy planet. So making compost cool again, just to recap on that, you always want to make sure it's covered with the bio cover or tarp. Keep the pile at the right temperature to kill weeds and disease. Nothing ever above 160, 131 to 160 for 3 to 5 days. Don't forget to turn your pile and check moisture. Recommended sources here, Teaming with Microbes book and Richard Perkins' agriculture book, or following him on YouTube is really good. He's a great composter. He's also done Dr. Elaine Ingham's certifications along with Troy and I. You know, Troy actually worked with Dr. Elaine Ingham at the Rodale Institute. We also have a 7-page document of books that we can email you to. And then Troy, reaching out to him with any questions. If you don't want to make your own compost, he has 5-gallon brew kits that you can purchase from his website, and he will tailor compost specific to your needs. It's $15 plus shipping, and it comes with the food. It comes with everything you need, which is really awesome. Then he can also analyze your compost and soil for you. Don't forget to listen to What's Brewing, a compost podcast. It is a really good podcast if you want a more in-depth version of compost tea. Here's a happy compost pile. I always try to put this up there to let people know that your compost pile is live and it needs to be checked on so it can be happy. And that's it. I went through the last part really quickly because I know we're over and I wanted to be mindful of everyone's time. You can always reach out to us at our email and go to our website. So I'll go back to Troy in case you want to get that information down. And do we have any questions? That was really fast at the end.
That was awesome. Yeah, thank you for the great information. We do have a few questions. So this one is from a while back. It says, when we were looking at the video of SCG building our compost pile, why does the pile need to be 4 to 5 feet high?
Okay, so earlier we were talking about how, well, 3 to 4 feet high, right? So a pile has been shown that it has to be able to sustain itself, right? And at 3 to 4 feet high, it creates its own barrier against the elements, right? If left alone, it can protect itself from overwatering because it has that big bio cover over it. It can somewhat protect itself from a windstorm. And it's the perfect size to make sure that it's protecting the core inside to keep the heat inside of it. Any smaller, you're going to have a hard time retaining the heat. It will just kind of go off and it won't stay hot for 3 to 5 days like it needs to. Also, it has a hard time retaining the moisture too. So over studies over a long period of time, they found that 3 to 4 feet is the minimum that you want to make your pile. The max you want to make a pile, I would say, is 6 feet.
Okay. All right. The next question says, if you're not planning to use your compost for a few months, what is the best way to store it?
Underneath, there's a slide I showed you where it had a cover. Just make sure there's still air around it, and make sure you have a cardboard barrier underneath it so all your microorganisms don't disappear, which they should stay in your pile for a while. The cardboard barrier, a cover on top, and just stick it in there. Once in a while, go in there and kind of lift it up with a pitchfork and air it out. But you can let it sit there for as long as you need, as long as you keep it moist. And once in a while you turn it. If your pile dries out, it can go dormant, or the microorganisms inside can die.
Okay. And then we have one more question. After you've brewed your compost tea, can you return the brewed compost to your bin?
To your compost? Yes. If you are a diehard composter, that is the way to go right there. The only thing I'd say is that, remember, the microorganisms, you brewed them with molasses or fish hydrolysis. You gave them foods to reproduce. So if you put them back into your compost pile, just make sure that they have enough food in there to keep alive and to keep reproducing. That's the only thing I recommend. But to inoculate your compost material and then put that out on the ground is going to be amazing as well. I will say that a lot of people use compost tea instead of compost because sometimes it can be much easier to just spray it than wheeling out barrels and barrels of heavy compost. So if you first lay down a nice compost layer on your garden, instead of having to reapply over and over again, you can just kind of once a year or twice a year put compost tea on it. But I like doing both personally. I like compost tea as much as I can and compost material once or twice a year.
Okay, awesome. And those are all the questions we have right now. Are we ready to go to the raffle? I have the names right here that I can draw.
Yes.